My name is Ruth Ellison. I am 72 years old, born and stitched together by small-town seasons in Maple Ridge, Ohio. I keep a tidy porch, a stubborn rosebush, a church choir robe, and a stubborn streak that my late husband used to call my anchor. Most days are quiet. A kettle sighing on the stove, the morning paper, the back-and-forth hello with our mailman, and a quilt in my lap that never quite gets finished because I love the visiting more than the stitching. 3 months ago the quiet tilted. It started with an envelope that wasn't for me. At least that's what I thought. It was thick, with glossy paper and a congratulatory tone I could feel even before I opened it. Policy issued. The front banner announced. I wasn't expecting anything. Inside I saw my name spelled neat as Sunday, Ruth A. Ellison. Under owner, it listed my son, Derek M. Ellison. Under beneficiary, only Derek again. The numbers were large. The words were clean and official. My hands went cool the way they do when a front is rolling in. I sat at the kitchen table with the letter, and let the kettle sing without turning it off. Derek had been strange lately. Showing up with cheerful groceries I didn't need, adjusting my thermostat with a frown about safety, and refilling my pill sorter with a commentary that sounded rehearsed. He'd take out his phone and say, "Mom, just for my budgeting app." Before photographing receipts I never asked him to pay. He'd pat the counter as if he owned it. He was not raised to be unkind, and yet a shadow had fallen across his voice. I kept wondering where the boy had gone who used to bring me dandelion bouquets in plastic cups. That afternoon, I brewed tea and put the letter back in its envelope, then into a cookbook nobody ever opens anymore. I watched the steam lift and made a promise to myself. No rushing, no shouting. Anchor down. I would not accuse. I would observe. The next day Derek came with a paper bag of new teas, the fancy kind in muslin sachets with names that sounded like European train stations. "Thought we'd upgrade the pantry," he said, bustling as if the kitchen were his set. "This one's calming. Good before a nap." He kissed the top of my head and something in the way he did it, too quick, too performative, made the hair at my neck prick. He set the kettle himself and made a cup for me while he hummed an old jingle. I watched him sprinkle something from a tiny amber bottle into the mug. A move so fast a camera might have missed it. But mothers don't miss the choreography of their children. I looked at the blue of the cup and thought about the letter tucked into coriander and cumin. "Let's drink together," I said. Derek raised his eyebrows, then poured himself water and pretended to sip. He was always a poor actor. I lifted the cup, inhaled and smiled. "You know what, honey? This needs a little honey." I turned and while my back was to him I poured the tea very slowly, into a clean mason jar I keep on the counter for leftover broth and applesauce. Then I filled my cup with plain hot water. I brought it back sweetened and made a show of drinking. He seemed satisfied. He glanced around at my pills, asked about refills and made some notes on his phone. When he left, he took the trash out, as if to be helpful, making sure the tea wrapper went with it. I stood there with the jar in my hand, my anchor set even deeper. Calm. Methodical. No speeches. My neighbor, Lila Nguyen, is 24 and rents the little carriage house behind my maple tree. She works part-time at the library and studies nursing at night. Lila has been quietly kind to me for a year, bringing me ripe pears from the Thursday market, carrying my salt for the icy steps, and refusing any money with a laugh. "You make me soup, Miss Ellison. That's payment enough." I called Lila and asked if she might stop by. She arrived within 10 minutes, hair in a messy bun, cheeks pink from the cold. I told her I had a jar of tea that made me uneasy and a letter that made me colder than that. She did not gasp or dramatize. She listened with her full face. "We can test for common sleep aids at the pharmacy," she said softly. "It's not lab grade, but it's real. Also, do you want to document things?" "Document," I repeated. The word felt like a coat that might be heavy at first but would keep me warm. That night, with Lila's help, I set up a small doorbell camera pointed toward my kitchen. We also tucked a tiny voice recorder under the lace runner on my table, the kind you click with your thumb. Lila taught me to check the red light. We practiced once while she read a paragraph from a library book to see if the mic picked up whispers. It did. Before bed, I sat down at my secretary desk and opened a new notebook. Log. I wrote at the top, the old schoolteacher in me coming out. I listed dates, times, and exactly what I had seen. The envelope, the tea, the amber bottle. I photocopied the letter at the church office and put the copy in my hymnal, not because I was hiding it from anyone exactly, but because hymns have a way of guarding things. Lila and I took the jar to the late-night pharmacy that offers health screenings, asking if they could check whether anything obvious was in the tea. The technician raised an eyebrow at me. There is an age at which people assume you are flustered and misremembering, and then looked at Lila and relaxed. They ran a quick panel and told us it suggested a drowsiness agent common in over-the-counter sleep products. Not medical advice, the technician said, careful and bored. But yeah, not just tea. In the car, Lila squeezed my hand. We'll move like water, she said. Slow. Clear. We gather facts, not fights. Over the next 2 weeks, Derek visited more often. He recommended I let him set up online access to my accounts just in case. He suggested I sign a paper that would make things easier if anything happened. He brought me soup I didn't eat, tea I sipped, and a new phone with a family plan already arranged. He turned my pill sorter toward him and narrated his helpfulness as if someone were recording. Someone was. On a Wednesday, he asked me to meet a friend at a coffee shop who knew about paperwork. I smiled and told him my knees were better than my pen right now. Could they come to the house? He hesitated, then agreed. When he brought the man to my kitchen, slick hair, a jacket too shiny, Lila happened to be there dropping off a jar. She stayed, polite as a cat in a sunbeam. I offered everyone coffee and placed the recorder on the table the way I always do now, my hand steady. The shiny man slid a document toward me with highlighted lines. Just your standard stuff, he said. So if you're ever unable to make decisions, your beloved son can help. I ask questions a retired teacher asks when a student tries to hand in something copied from the back of the math book. Where does this line lead? Who benefits from this clause? What happens to that if I wake up from whatever unable means? The man smiled the way a sign smiles when it says bridge out, but hopes you read it too late. Let me take this to my pastor, I said, gathering the pages. I don't sign things I don't pray over. The man looked at Derek. Derek laughed too loudly and said, Sure, Mom. Take your time. When they left, Lila and I stood in the quiet. We reviewed the footage, listened to the little recorder's brave click. My favorite part was not the sound of their voices, but the sound of mine, the river moving. That night I took a step that felt both small and enormous. I took out my old will, which split everything between Derek and the church, and I wrote a letter to my attorney asking for an appointment. Then I wrote another letter by hand in blue ink. To my neighbor and friend Ms. Lila Nguyen, who has kept watch over me not for money but for love, I want to say thank you. I did not yet know the shape of what that thank you would be. But gratitude, like rivers, carves its own canyon over time. I slept with the recorder on my nightstand, a new kind of lullaby. When the morning came, the envelope in the cookbook seemed heavier. The day after that, Derek knocked early with muffins and said cheerfully that he had some exciting updates about my future. I looked at the red light under the lace and said, So do I. I have always believed in kindness, but I have learned that kindness and clarity are twins. You can't have one without the other. So I decided to play along, but on my terms, clear, documented, calm. If Derek was keeping a script, I would keep a ledger. The exciting updates turned out to be another appointment with the shiny jacket man. This time with a folder labeled contingency planning. I gave them cookies on a plate my mother used for bridge club because when you're hosting, you host. Lila sat at the end of the table knitting something moss green and quiet. I knew she could listen while counting stitches. What a talent. Mom, Derek began with his best son voice. We love you and want to make sure everything is smooth. This policy, he tapped a page with my name on it, is just responsible. Responsible, I repeated. Like wearing a seatbelt. Exactly, he brightened. And if anything happened, I'd be able to handle bills, decisions, phone calls. No chaos. The man slid another document over, this one with more highlights than white space. And here, he said, tapping a signature line, is where you authorize your son to manage any proceeds. He said the last word like it tasted expensive. I picked up my reading glasses, the ones with the tiny rhinestones Lila says look fabulous, and read every word out loud. Not quickly. A river may be gentle, but it still moves. I asked for definitions. I requested a copy of each page to review with my advisor. They blinked. Your advisor? Derek asked. Lila looked up from her knitting and said, Hi. The man laughed nervously. I didn't. After they left, Lila and I did what we had been doing. We logged. We time-stamped. We backed up audio and video to a little cloud folder she made for me with a password only we knew. Anchored River 72. She taught me to check the recordings for hiss and to keep the recorder charged. I loved how practical this all felt. Not dramatic, not sneaky, just housekeeping for the truth. Meanwhile, I made an appointment with my attorney, Ms. Ortega, who has warm hands and a typewriter bell on her desk she uses as a paperweight. I brought the policy letter, copies of the documents, and my notebook. I told her I was not ready to press any big red buttons. I wanted to understand my options and stay safe. She nodded and said, We can build fences without declaring war. Bless that woman. We added a temporary freeze to my accounts that required my in-person signature for any new authorizations. We registered my phone number with the bank as voice verification only. We put a note in my file. Communicate in writing. Confirm with Ms. Ellison directly. Quiet fences. We also talked about my will. I told Ms. Ortega about Lila, the pears, the salt, the late-night pharmacy ride, the knitting at my table in case the men returned. Ms. Ortega listened, then asked, What do you want your legacy to teach? I sat with that question like a warm cup between my hands. I wanted to teach that love isn't a ledger, I said. And I wanted to teach that care counts. She outlined options. I could amend the will to leave my home to Lila, with a simple instruction that she could keep it or sell it as she needed. I could set aside a small scholarship at the library for nursing students who logged volunteer hours with seniors. I could write Derek a letter, not a legal one, a mother one, explaining why choices have consequences. We planned it all careful as quilting. Back home, I baked a pie to have a reason to see Lila. We sat with slices at the table and I told her straight, I'm changing my will. She covered her mouth with her hand, not to hide a smile, but to hold in 100 feelings. Ms. Ellison, I don't. I know, I said. That's why. I asked Lila for one more favor. Would you help me set up that little camera in the corner to capture the table and the stove? He likes to bustle around the kettle. She did, adjusting it with the patience of a surgeon. She also placed another tiny recorder under the couch cushion where Derek always plopped down to deliver his speeches. We tested both. We wrote it all in the log. The next day brought another tea ceremony. Derek, smiling, produced a new sachet and a brand new mug with a cheerful slogan. While he leaned toward the stove, I watched his sleeve ride up and reveal the edge of the tiny amber bottle again. My heart did that old horse kick it sometimes does, but the rest of me was steady. I asked him to fetch the honey from the pantry. The second he turned, I poured the tea into a new jar and replaced my cup with hot water. I sweetened it, sipped, complimented his taste. He beamed. Later, Lila and I went for the testing kit again. Same result. Not just tea. I wrote, not just tea, in my log 3 times, then drew a small river beside it. We also captured Derek on audio telling me I seemed so groggy lately, must be that age. With a little chuckle that still sits on my shelf like a dusty, unwanted gift. I am not naive. I know mistakes have roots. Derek has been struggling. He lost a contract and started hanging around men who measure life in deals. He hates asking for help because he wants to look like the hero. I tried to keep that in my vision while I protected myself. Love with clarity. Fences without war. A week after the second tea, Derek brought a friend who he introduced as a consultant, who could streamline things. The friend carried a leather folio and used too many adjectives. While he outlined a plan that sounded like a choke collar for my life, I asked if I could record the conversation, because I'm forgetful lately. Everyone laughed. I pressed the button. What would happen, I asked innocently, if I changed my plans later? Say I want to leave the house to someone else after all? The consultant gave a line that will be useful for the rest of my days. Well, once we set this up, that would be complicated. Complicated, I repeated, and wrote it in my log as he spoke. 2 days later, I hosted a little supper, pot roast and green beans, for Derek, the consultant, my pastor, and Lila. I said I wanted to pray over my plans and get counsel. The consultant's smile thinned. Derek looked at the roast as if it were a test he hadn't studied for. We ate, we blessed the meal, we made small talk about the weather as if it hadn't been the same every day for a week. When the plates were cleared, I stood, my knees steady, and said, "Before we discuss signatures and policies, I have something to show you." I took the remote and turned on my television, where Lila had helped me load a little slideshow. On the screen, dates, times, lists. A simple clip of the kettle and the cups. A close-up still of the amber bottle's neck as a sleeve lifted. A freeze frame of Derek's hand near my pill sorter. Then a transcript on the screen of not just tea. Thanks to Lila's friend who knows how to generate subtitles. No accusations. Just facts on the wall. No one spoke for a heartbeat that stretched all the way to my first day of kindergarten. Then Derek stood so fast he jostled the table. "You set me up," he said, his voice trying to find a shape. "I set the truth out," I said, "so we could all see it." The consultant began rearranging papers as if gravity had changed. My pastor folded his hands. Lila's knitting sat like a calm animal on her lap. "I don't want to call anyone," I said, "but I will. Before I do, I am asking for honesty." I looked at my son, the baby I had carried, the boy who once cried over a bird with a broken wing. "Tell me what you have been doing. There is a corner you can watch someone reach." Derek reached it. He sat back down. He didn't look at the consultant. He didn't look at Lila. He looked at his hands. "I got in over my head," he said. "I told myself it was temporary. I said I'd never go too far. But the line kept moving." I nodded. "Lines do that when you don't anchor them." He cried then, quiet, not performative. I did not touch him. My hands stayed on the table, palms down like paperweights on a windy day. I said, "We will pause here. No more visits unless Lila is present. No more papers. No more teas. Tomorrow I will take everything to Ms. Ortega. And I will make my will reflect what has been true. That care counts." The next morning, while the sun was still shaking frost from the grass, Lila drove me to Ms. Ortega's office. We signed the new will. My house and the little savings I have will go to Lila Nguyen, who watered my geraniums in July and salted my steps in January and drove at midnight to check a jar. A modest scholarship will go to the library for students like her. For Derek, there is a single letter and an invitation. If you want to be part of my life, you will rebuild trust plank by plank. There is no shortcut. We notarized. We made copies. We placed one in my hymnal again, and I hummed as I did it. Then I went home and made soup because when you're moving through a storm you keep eating. I hoped it wouldn't come to law, but storms don't check our calendars. A week after the supper, a social worker from the county called. Someone, perhaps the pharmacist tech, perhaps the consultant who didn't like being put in a slideshow, had reported possible financial exploitation. The phrase felt clinical and merciful at the same time. They asked if I was safe. I said yes. They asked if I had documentation. I said yes. Lila sat beside me at the kitchen table, her hands around a mug, her eyes steady as a lighthouse. What followed was not a shouting drama. It was paperwork, interviews, and folders. I shared my log. I played them the recordings. I showed them the little video stills and the transcripts Lila's friend had helped with. The social worker thanked me for keeping records. "You made this easy to see," she said. "That was all I had wanted all along." They spoke with Derek. They spoke with the consultant. They collected the policy details and the bank freezes Ms. Ortega had helped set. They explained the process. The county would refer the case to the prosecutor, who would decide charges. I felt oddly calm. I had already done the part that was mine. When papers arrived with official seals, I cried in my kitchen for the first time since this began. Not because I regretted documenting, because the shape of consequence had finally settled over my son, and it looked like a heavy coat on a thin boy. Lila held my hand. "We can be steady and sad at the same time," she said. "Isn't that wisdom? Two true things can fit in one palm." On the first day in court, the room smelled like wood polish and nerves. I sat on a bench beside Lila. Across the aisle, Derek stared at the floor. He wore a suit he couldn't quite carry and the face of a child who knows the principal has seen the whole report. The judge listened. The attorneys used careful words. They played a portion of the audio where Derek suggested I sign the highlighted forms, just in case, and chuckled about my grogginess. They showed the still frames of the kettle sessions. The judge's eyes were kind but firm. When it was my turn, I stood with my hand on a rail smooth from years of other hands. I said, I am not here because I want to crush my son. I am here because I want the truth to be the thing we build from. I am safe. I have support. I wanted it all on the record, so no one could tell us later that our memories were confused. The judge nodded as if we were in my kitchen over cookies. The prosecutor recommended penalties that included community service, a fine, and a class about protecting older adults' rights. There was talk of heavier paths, 2 doors I did not want us to walk through if we didn't have to. When the judge asked if I wished to make a statement, I said yes. Your Honor, I said, and I felt my anchor and my river both in my chest. I forgive my son. Forgiveness is not the same as pretending nothing happened. It is choosing a future with boundaries. I am asking the court to impose a fine, to require restitution for the costs I incurred protecting myself, and to order the classes. I am not asking for anything that takes away his years. I am asking for something that might give them back. The judge looked at Derek. Mr. Ellison? Derek's voice shook. He accepted the terms. He looked at me then finally and whispered, I'm sorry, Mom. I nodded once. Words are cheap until they've pulled weight for a while. A week later, with the case resolved, I met Ms. Ortega once more to finalize a few small things and to place sealed copies of the will where they needed to go. She asked if I wanted to include an addendum with advice to future readers. I laughed. Always, I said. So I wrote a page for whoever might find it one day. Document. Move like water. Build fences without war. And remember that care counts. I also wrote the letter to Derek that Ms. Ortega had suggested. Nothing legal, everything essential. I told him I loved the boy he was and that I was waiting to meet the man he could be. I told him that trust is something you build in daylight, with small boards and honest nails. I told him that my door would be open for coffee, with the kettle watched by both of us. As for Lila, we celebrated on my porch with iced tea we brewed together, 2 tea bags, no surprises. I put the deed packet in her hands, and she tried to hand it back, eyes spilling. I can't, she said. You already have, I said. Every time you knocked without being asked. We agreed she would keep living in the carriage house until she finished school, and then we'd decide together what was next. She has dreams, that girl. I want my house to have more of them. Some people asked me gently if I regretted leaving Derek out of the will. I told them regret is a poor carpenter. It doesn't build a thing, it just waves its arms. I chose to build. I chose to say with my will that love listens and shows up with pears and pharmacy runs and salt for the steps, without a ledger. I chose to say that forgiveness is real, but so are fences. I chose to say that when you are tempted to push a line, you stop and you anchor it instead. At church, after everything, Mrs. Lang from the alto section patted my shoulder and said, Ruth, you handled this like a lady and a lighthouse. I don't know about the lady part, but I am grateful for the light we found. I am telling this in my own voice because I want those of you my age to know. You are allowed to be both tender and thorough. Keep a log. Learn to press record. Ask for help from the good neighbors. Make soup. Don't let anyone rush you. If something tastes wrong, you do not have to swallow it to be polite. Now, because this is a story and story should end with a question that keeps the porch light on a little longer, I will ask you straight from my table to yours. Was I right to leave my son with nothing in my will, and to ask the court to give him a fine instead of taking his years? What would you have done?